The rain had been falling since mid-afternoon. It was the kind of cold November rain that does not announce itself dramatically. It simply arrives and refuses to leave, seeping through wool, settling into boots, turning the ground to a gray paste that swallows sounds. Inside the mess hall, there was light and warmth and the smell of hot food. Outside, pressed against the wall of the building, where a canvas awning had been promised and never hung, sat the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, trays balanced on their knees, water running down their necks, eating what they could before the cold took the heat from their food entirely. The men inside the mess hall wore the same uniform, belonged to the same army, fought on the same front. The men outside had, in the preceding weeks, been killing German soldiers with the same shells, breathing the same cordite smoke, burying the same friends. But inside was inside, and outside was outside. That gap between what is just and what exists is where this story begins. Before anything else, a word about what we know and how we know it. The specific operational report filed that November has not survived in any archive that historians have yet located. The mess hall itself, the captain who enforced the policy, the precise unit designation of the support company, these details exist in fragments, in letters, in sworn testimony collected decades later, and in the documented behavioral pattern of one 3-star general who was, by any measure, a man of profound contradictions. What follows is a reconstruction, not an invention. The night happened. The people were real. The behavior fits, on every side, what the historical record consistently shows about each of them. Where certainty ends, this account says so, and does not pretend otherwise. The record should exist. Part of what this story is about is why it sometimes doesn't. The 761st Tank Battalion arrived in France in October of 1944 as the first all-black armored battalion in the history of the United States Army. Read that sentence again slowly, because inside it is a compressed archive of what 2 years had looked like before that arrival. 2 years of training at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, and later Camp Hood, Texas, while white units trained, shipped out, and went to war. 2 years of watching the war happen to other people. 2 years of passes that were revoked without explanation, of base facilities divided by signs that nobody bothered to make official because everybody understood the arrangement without the signs. 2 years of being told, in ways both formal and informal, in policies and in silences, and in 100 daily administrative decisions, that the United States Army was not entirely certain it needed these men. In the summer of 1944, before the battalion shipped out, a young second lieutenant named Jackie Robinson, who had played football at UCLA and would later do something considerable with a baseball, was riding a bus on the base at Camp Hood when a dispatcher told him to move to the back. Robinson refused. He was court-martialed. The Army eventually acquitted him, but the process cost him his place with the 761st. He never went to Europe with them. The battalion went without him. They went because of a man named Paul Bates. Colonel Paul L. Bates was white and from Ohio, and had been given command of the 761st at a moment when the assignment was understood, within the officer class of the United States Army, to be a polite career ending. You took a command like this when you had nowhere better to go, or when someone needed to be parked somewhere that looked like responsibility, but wasn't. Other officers made this calculation out loud in Bates's presence and said so plainly. Bates disagreed with the calculation. He stayed. Over 2 years he was offered transfers. He was offered promotions that would have required him to leave. He declined each one. His explanation, recalled by men who served under him and recorded in their testimonies years afterward, was not ideological in its framing. It was practical, in the way that men of that generation and that profession expressed things they felt deeply. He said something close to this. "I trained these men. I know their names. The army has plenty of officers who can replace me somewhere else. These men deserve a commander who does not leave." He did not leave. Following the battalion into France, not as a soldier but as something equally necessary, came a man named Ted Anderson. Anderson wrote for the Pittsburgh Courier, which was at that time one of the most important black newspapers in the United States, read in barbershops and church vestibules and kitchen tables from Pennsylvania to California. He was a military correspondent, which meant he was credentialed, he was present, and he was systematically ignored by the Army's press apparatus, which reviewed black correspondents' copy with a thoroughness and delay it did not apply to reporters from white publications. Anderson wrote anyway. He filed his reports knowing they might sit in a censor's drawer for 2 weeks before anyone decided whether they constituted a security risk or merely an inconvenience. He kept his notebooks with the same discipline a soldier keeps a rifle, because he understood that his job was not to be read in the moment, but to ensure the record existed. A record existed, he believed, whether or not anyone was currently reading it. The reading could come later. The not writing could not be undone. On the 2nd of November, 1944, General George S. Patton personally requested the 761st Tank Battalion for his Third Army. This was not routine. Other general officers had passed on the unit. The Army's informal machinery of assignment had ways of routing black units away from commanders who did not request them, and most commanders did not request them. Patton had read their training reports. He had looked at their marksmanship evaluations, their vehicle maintenance records, their scores in simulated combat exercises. He said, in terms that were unambiguous, "Send them." The speech he gave to the battalion before they moved forward has been quoted, checked, cross-referenced, and confirmed through multiple accounts. He stood on the hood of a half-track in the gray morning light and told these men, who had spent 2 years being told the Army wasn't sure about them, that he had asked for them specifically, that he did not care about the color of a man's skin when that man could shoot and maintain and fight, and that he expected them to make the enemy fear the day they were born. For men who had eaten outside in the rain, while others ate inside in the warmth, those words carried a weight that Patton probably understood and possibly intended. He was not a simple man. He was not a good man, in any uncomplicated sense of the word. But he was a general who had asked for them when other generals had not, and in November of 1944 in northern France, that was not nothing. The mess hall incident happened in the middle of November. The battalion had been pulled back from the line for 48 hours. 2 days to sleep, to eat, to write letters, to sit in a building with a roof over their heads. They had been in contact with the enemy. They had lost people. The particular arithmetic of combat, who is here this morning, who was not here yesterday, who will not be here tomorrow, had been doing its work on them for weeks. The support unit's commanding captain met them at the mess facility with the expression of a man explaining something he considered self-evident. There was a policy, he said. The facility was not set up for integrated dining. There was a covered area outside. He gestured in a direction that contained no covered area, only a wall and the continuing rain and a temperature of approximately 3 degrees Celsius. The soldiers ate on the ground. Inside, 40 feet away, other soldiers ate at tables. 2 people were paying close attention. Ted Anderson, who had been given access to the rear area through his correspondence credentials, noted everything: the time, the date, the names and ranks he could confirm, the length of time the men remained outside, the weather conditions, the temperature, the absence of the promised awning. His notebook went into his bag. The bag stayed with him. A sergeant whose name does not appear in the sources available, a man who had, in his civilian life before the war, wanted to be a teacher and who would eventually become one, went back to his billet that night and wrote a report. Not a complaint, not a letter, not an appeal. A military report, formatted correctly, unemotional in its language, precise in its particulars, structured in the way that military documents are structured so that a reader cannot dismiss them as personal grievance. He had understood, somewhere in his 2 years of service, that a document written like a personal complaint could be filed as a personal complaint. A document written like a military report had to be responded to as a military report. He filed it the next morning. The major who received it told him, honestly, that it would probably sit in a folder. It did not sit in a folder. Through a network of connections and debts and informal relationships that the official organizational chart of the Third Army did not contain, but that any functioning institution actually runs on, the report moved upward. Through a brigade staff officer who owed a favor to someone who knew someone. Through an aide who had opinions about what his general should and should not see. It arrived eventually on the desk of George Patton. The adjutant remembered it clearly, decades later, the way men remember the moments when they watch someone make a decision. Patton read the report once, set it down, picked it up, and read it again. The second reading was slower, the kind of slowness that is not confusion, but absorption, a man letting something land in him fully rather than processing it and moving on. The adjutant, who had served with Patton long enough to read the silences between actions, said later that something shifted in the room during those few minutes. Not dramatically, not with any visible expression that he could name precisely. Just a change in the quality of attention, the way a room changes when someone in it makes up their mind. Patton set the report down a second time. He asked one question. "Is this in our operational zone?" The adjutant confirmed that it was. "Prepare the car." The adjutant hesitated for a fraction of a second, not out of disobedience, but out of the reasonable assumption that logistics required a morning departure, that roads in the dark and rain required daylight to navigate safely, that whatever needed doing would still need doing at 6 in the morning. SAS. "Will you want to leave at first light, sir?" Patton looked at him. Now. It was late evening. The rain had not stopped. 100 miles of French road in November, at night, in a staff car with blackout headlights, which meant driving by the narrow slitted light of 2 lamps designed not to be seen from the air, on roads that were wet and badly marked and shared intermittently with military convoys moving in the opposite direction. The car carried 3 people, Patton, the adjutant, and a corporal driver who had been with the general long enough to understand that when a late-night departure was ordered, questions were not part of his role. The corporal drove. The adjutant sat with a map he could barely read by the light of a shielded flashlight. Patton sat in the back and said nothing for the entirety of the drive. 100 miles. In those conditions, more than 2 hours. The adjutant wrote about it afterward, not immediately, but years later, when someone was collecting accounts for a regimental history that was never published and exists now only in a small archive in Maryland. He wrote that he had served under several general officers in his career and had ridden in many staff cars and had learned to read the emotional temperature of a vehicle the way a sailor reads weather. This ride, he wrote, felt like a man going to do something he had already entirely decided to do. There was no deliberation left in it. Whatever internal argument had occurred had concluded before they got in the car. They arrived after midnight. The facility's duty officer was a lieutenant who had been reading a novel. He remembered the novel specifically, years later, because the moment of looking up from it and seeing 3 people standing in the rain outside the duty window was the kind of sensory bookmark the mind creates around certain experiences. He came outside. He saw the stars on the coat in the darkness. He understood, in the way that a junior officer understands when something is beyond his rank to interpret, that he should do whatever was asked of him immediately and without requiring explanation. He wrote to his wife the following week and told her that in 12 years of service, he had never before felt from a superior officer the specific quality of attention he felt that night. The attention, he wrote, of a man who has already made his decision and is simply executing it, and who requires from you only your cooperation and not your opinion. He cooperated. He did not offer his opinion. Patton asked to see the commanding officer of the support unit. The duty officer woke him. What followed, the walk through the facility, was methodical. Patton moved through the mess hall, the serving area, the kitchen, the supply corridor, and then out the back door to the exterior wall, where, some hours earlier, soldiers returning from the front had sat on wet ground and eaten cold food in the rain. The ground was still wet. This detail appears in 2 separate accounts and seems to have registered on everyone present. The physical evidence, the mud still bearing the impressions of where trays had been set down, the wall still streaked with the rain that had run off the roofline, and nowhere else. Patton looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at the support unit's commanding officer. "Explain this to me." The commanding officer explained. There was a policy. The facility was not configured for integrated dining. The relevant regulations were clear on the matter of separate facilities. For separate, he used a word that the sources available to us record only as having been a word that Patton then caused him to stop using. The regulations existed. He had followed them. He had not invented the regulations. Patton's response was recorded in a letter written by the duty officer, who was present for the exchange, and confirmed in general outline by the adjutant's later account. It was not long. It was specific. It was, by all available testimony, delivered in a tone of complete calm, which the men present agreed was more alarming than anger would have been. "In my operational zone," Patton said, "incorrect regulations cease to apply not because they are regulations, but because I say they cease to apply." He said several other things. They are not available to us verbatim. The accounts agree on the substance, that what had happened that evening was not going to happen again, that the supply of tables in the storage room appeared to him to be adequate for the purpose of correcting the situation, and that he would be informed by morning whether his assessment of the table supply was accurate. At 6 o'clock the following morning, the soldiers of the 761st Tank Battalion walked through the front door of the mess facility, took trays from the stack at the serving line, and sat down at tables. 6 tables had been moved out of storage during the night. The wooden floor was still uneven where the table legs had been dragged into position. 2 groups of men ate in the same room. They did not, by most accounts, speak to each other in any notable way. They ate. The food was hot. The room had a roof. Outside, the rain continued. It is a modest scene, considered objectively. 2 groups of men eating breakfast in a building, measured against the scale of what was happening that November across the breadth of Northern Europe, against the distances being fought over, the numbers of people dying on all sides, the enormous grinding machinery of a world at war. 6 tables moved in the night is a very small thing. Considered from where the soldiers of the 761st were sitting, it was not small. The official record of what Patton did that night runs to 7 words. 7 words in an administrative log filed under facility operations, dated the morning after his arrival. Dining arrangement modified to accommodate all personnel without separation. No mention of a 3-star general driving 100 miles in the rain after midnight. No mention of the previous evening's arrangement. No mention of the wet ground or the missing awning or the temperature or the men who had just come off the line. 7 words, passive voice, bureaucratic tense, the language of a thing that simply happened without cause or agent, like weather. This is how institutions record the things they are not proud of having required someone to fix. Now, the honest account. Patton's midnight drive was an act of personal authority. It was not a legal reform. It was not a policy change. It was one general, in one operational zone, on one night, moving 6 tables. The United States Army remained formally segregated. It would remain formally segregated until July of 1948, when President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, which desegregated the armed forces by presidential directive, 3 years and 8 months after the night in question. In 1945, Patton was relieved of his command of the Third Army. The reasons were multiple and documented. Among them was his handling of displaced persons camps in the American occupation zone, Jewish survivors of the Nazi camps, whom Patton described in his private diary in language that is not reproducible here, and that represents, by any fair measure, a moral failure of the first order. The man who drove 100 miles in the rain because soldiers were eating outside drove those same miles inside a mind that held other things as well. History does not clean up after itself. The midnight drive was real. The diary entries were real. Both of these are true simultaneously, and any accounting that omits either one is not honest. Reuben Rivers was a staff sergeant in the 761st. On the 10th of November, 1944, his tank was hit by a German anti-tank round that tore open his leg. The wound was serious enough to warrant evacuation. Rivers refused evacuation. He continued to command his vehicle and lead his section through another 12 days of combat. He was killed in action on the 19th of November, 1944. The Medal of Honor citation describing his actions was written and submitted, and then held, reviewed, returned, revised, questioned, and delayed for 52 years. It was presented to his sister, Grace Rivers, in January of 1997 by President Bill Clinton at a ceremony that also honored 6 other black soldiers from the Second World War whose decorations had been similarly delayed. 52 years. George Patton died on the 21st of December, 1945, from injuries sustained in a vehicle accident in Heidelberg, Germany. He had survived the entire war and died 12 days after a peacetime collision on a military road. He was 60 years old. The sergeant who wrote the report, whose name the available sources do not preserve, which is itself a kind of document, came home after the war, enrolled in college under the GI Bill, completed a degree in education, and taught history in a public school for 27 years. He taught in the same city where he had grown up, to students who were, in many cases, the children of people he had known before the war. He told the story of the mess hall. He told it every year, near the end of the academic year, when students asked him what it had been like. He told it, by all accounts from those who were his students and who have since been interviewed, not as a story about Patton. He was clear about that every time. He was careful about it. He did not want the story to become a story about a general being magnanimous. He wanted it to be understood as a story about a report. He had written the report, he told his students, because the report needed to exist. Not because he was certain it would go anywhere. Not because he believed with confidence that it would reach someone with the power and inclination to act on it. He had written it because the record had to include what had happened. Because if the record did not include it, then in some administrative and therefore real sense, it had not happened. The mud would dry. The ground would be walked on. The wall would be repainted. And there would be nothing, no mark, no trace, no evidence, that on a cold November night in 1944, soldiers who had been fighting for 5 weeks sat in the rain and ate cold food on the ground, while 40 feet away, inside a lit building, other soldiers ate at tables. He wrote it so the record would say otherwise. The midnight visit was a footnote, he told them. A dramatic footnote, yes, an effective one. But a footnote to the real thing, which was a page of paper, written in pencil, in the cramped and careful hand of a man who understood that documentation is not a bureaucratic act. It is an act of insistence, an insistence that what happened, happened, that the people it happened to were real. That reality does not disappear simply because the people in power find it inconvenient to acknowledge. I wrote the report, he told his students, every year at the end, because it had to exist. 6 tables, 100 miles, 7 words in a log, and 1 page of paper written by a soldier who ate outside in the rain that said, "This is what was done. This is who we were. Let the record show."